or if you're absent. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and begin. And if you look on your outline, we're going to start with the topic. Actually, we have a Bible quote. Okay, we have a Bible quote, so I want to start with that one. It's from Matthew's Gospel. Can someone attempt to read that for us? At the very top, it comes from Matthew. We had a couple readings from Matthew the other day. It's just one verse. Let's see, Annie? All right, many are called, but few are chosen. How many of you have ever heard that passage before, or that phrase? Many are called, but few are chosen. What do you think that means? What do you think that means? These are words spoken by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. What do you think that means? Many are called, but few are chosen. What do you think that means? It almost sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not quite. See, John?
That like God calls you in, but not always you're gonna.
Okay, so God calls everybody, or at least, well, I think we would say everybody, but not everybody necessarily follows, right?
Yeah.
So maybe they hear the call, but they just don't feel that they can actually go and follow, okay? That's a pretty good answer. In fact, this Bible passage is part of one of the parables that Jesus told. This one was the wedding feast. And if you remember that parable, in the story, a king gives a big feast, and he sends out invitations to everybody. Does anybody remember that parable? Remember what happens in the story? Like, he's inviting everybody to come to this great banquet. It's going to be a swinging good time. See, Anna?
That's where Jesus will do the fish and the loaves.
Well, I'll tell you, actually,
That's the wedding at Cana.
yeah, that's an actual event. This is actually a parable. So this is a story that Jesus kind of created on the fly. And in the story, there was a king, and he sent out invitations to everybody to come to this great feast, this great banquet. In the story, as people got their invitations, they were like, I'm busy. I can't come. I got to do this, or I got to do that. And in the end, the king really gets upset. He's like, I sent out this invitation to everybody, and they don't want to come. Well, we'll get someone to come, so I'll ask other people. And they'll be able to feast and have a great time. And those other people, they're going to miss out. Okay? And then Jesus says, many are called, but few are chosen. In other words, the king wanted everybody to come, but not everybody felt the desire to actually come. Okay? All right, so let's get into the first question there, which is, what is a vocation? Okay? And of course, we're going to identify a definition for this, but if I ask you, and I know you've heard this word before, what is a vocation? In your own words, how would you describe it? How would you describe it? See Harrison in the back?
God calling you to do something.
God calling you to do something. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Anyone want to add to that? Annie, you had your hand up pretty quickly. What you do with your life. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, let me go ahead and pull up the description here. Those were really good answers. The Bible passage. And we have actually two questions. It's what is a vocation and what is a vocation not? Okay? Sometimes understanding what something is, you first have to identify what it is not. So let's go ahead and take the second question. All right, thank you. Which is, a vocation is not only, I use the word solely, okay? It's not just a career or a profession. So, Annie said, what you're going to do with your life. I mean, there's a truth to that, but we want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that that's all that it is. Like it's just the job that you have. Okay, a job is something that you get a paycheck for, right? But a vocation goes beyond that. Okay, a vocation is more than just what you're going to do for a living, what you're trained to do. It's much more than that. But let's start with that it's not only what you do for a living. Okay? Now let's get a little bit more into the definition. And Harrison, you had a really good starting spot there. A vocation is a call. In fact, it comes from the Latin for call. Okay? When you see those first three letters, voc, V-O-C, or voca, what do you think of? Well, it's very similar to voice. Okay, vocal is when you actually make a sound. All right, so if somebody calls to you, all right, they're very vocal, so it is a call. And the other part of it is it's a call to holiness from God, so it does come from God, so we established that, to follow a pathway to serve and love God. I know it sounds kind of wordy, but I mean, really, when you think about it, it's a call from God to serve and love. It's a call from God to serve and love. That's about as simple as you can really make it. Okay. Now, the first story that I want to share with you, this is very brief, is about Saint Mother Teresa. Okay? Can someone tell us something about Mother Teresa? Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Anyone know anything about her background? She's one of our more well-known contemporary saints, very much from our own time. She died in 1997, you can see there, and she was just canonized a few years ago. In fact, her canonization date is coming up here in a couple weeks. Okay? Well, the reason why I mentioned Mother Teresa, if you don't know her story, she was actually born in 1910 in Albania, or in that area. So she was Albanian, but she then later, many years later, moved to Calcutta, and that's why, at the end of her life, she was often referred to as Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Well, the reason why I want to mention her is that in 1946, she started the Sisters of Charity, which was the religious order that she was the head of and that she lived, the last several decades of her life leading, okay? The Sisters of Charity, which still exists today, okay, long after she has passed, they wear the very, very well-known, the white sari, with the blue trim, okay? All of the members of that religious order wear that. And of course, they're dedicated to the poor. But she started that in 1946. And the phrase that I want to share with you is she said that starting the Sisters of Charity was a call within a call. So what do you think Mother Teresa meant by that? She was in her mid-30s when she started the Sisters of Charity. She said it was a call within a call. So what do you think Mother Teresa meant by that? See, Gabriel?
She was called to be like a Catholic or like a nun.
Okay.
And when she was a nun, she was called to make like a cheer.
That's right. Yeah, so she had two calls. She had the one to the religious life when she decided to become a nun, okay? And then after a few years, after she had taken her vows, she said, I want to do more than just be a nun, okay? I want to actually start an order that's going to be very designed to help out a particular group of people in the world, okay? And when she started the Sisters of Charity, which was dedicated to the poor in India, that was her second call. So the call came within her call to become a nun, okay? And, I mean, she's world famous for her work with the poor of India. In fact, she won a Nobel Peace Prize in the late 70s for her work. So, I mean, she's become iconic. But it was her call, and it wasn't her desire to become famous, okay? But it was her call from God to follow and to do that, okay? All right, let's go ahead and move on. And on your paper, there is a column. Let's talk about what are called the 4 vocational paths. There are 4 of them, okay? And you might actually know these. So I'm going to ask, okay? And there is kind of an order, but I'm not too worried about that. Does anyone know what one of the 4 vocational paths are? One of the 4 callings from God? Let's see, Cameron? Okay, so the priesthood, it's also sometimes called the diaconate also, because a person might decide to become a priest or a deacon. That's one of them. Lizzie? The married life, which is when a person decides to seek marriage and the family life. Okay, that's 2 of them. See, I knew you guys knew this. See, AJ?
Be a nun or a monk.
Okay, which is the religious life. There's 3 of them. Okay, and then there's one more. This is the one that a lot of people kind of forget about, because when they hear that word vocation, they think, oh, you're going to become a priest, or you're going to become a nun. It's like all or nothing, okay? No pun intended there on that nun. But there's one more. There's one more. See, Annie? Yeah, the single life. Exactly. All right? So, your vocational call might not necessarily involve becoming a priest or a nun or a monk, okay? You might choose to be single. So Not to be too editorial on my selections there, I got a guy delivering pizza. Not a slam against people who deliver pizza, but that one is the image I use for the single life. So the vocational call would be a person who decides whatever job they might have, and they could have any kind of job, but they feel that marriage is not their calling, okay? But they still want to serve God. They still want to use their life to serve God and to, of course, serve and love other people as well. One of the things I want to mention here is that none of these vocational paths are better than the other. Now, I know a lot of times people think, oh, well, becoming the priest, that must be like the ultimate vocational path. Well, if that's your calling, it is. But if it's not from God, then it's not the right path to follow, okay? Maybe the single life is what God is calling you towards, okay? So keep in mind, all of these are completely legitimate as long as the person answers their call that they receive. Okay, number 2, I think you probably know that that's going to be the married life, when people feel called to marriage and to family. Some people do, some people don't. Okay? Completely legitimate. So a person who follows this vocational path is going to dedicate themselves to their spouse, to the children that they might perhaps will have, and they will try to serve and love God and other people. And of course, in all the ways that works. All right, the third one is the religious life, which we just mentioned a moment ago. And that, of course, would be people, women who decide to become nuns, men who decide to become monks, and to live the religious life. It's a calling, okay? And then finally, this was one we mentioned earlier, is the priesthood or the diaconate. So to either become a priest or a deacon for those who are called. Okay? All right. You guys really already knew that, but that's good. Okay, we're going to get into some stories. On your paper, there's a little chart, and I want to share with you some stories from both the Old and New Testament of people in the Bible receiving a call from God and then responding a little bit differently. Some of these people we're going to talk about responded to God forcefully and positively, and others were kind of lukewarm, kind of like, well, okay, maybe I'll follow, and some couldn't follow. All right, so you might know some of these people, some of them perhaps not. So who's the first person on our chart? And then we'll talk about them. And you might know about some of these people. So again, I like to kind of see what you might already know. Who's number 1 on the list? This is already on your paper. It's not a trivia question here. See Cameron? Yeah, Gideon. Gideon. Does anyone know anything about Gideon? Anybody know what book of the Bible you can read about Gideon? Okay, well, Gideon is in the Old Testament. It's in the book of Judges. Gideon was one of the judges of ancient Israel. Does anybody remember anything about the book of Judges? Do you know what that book's like? I know that would have been in 6th grade, so that's a couple years ago. No takers on that? Well, the book of Judges is the book that describes how the Israelites retook the land of Canaan. Okay, you know, Moses and Joshua got them into the promised land, and then they literally had to fight their way through to claim it. So it's a book that is filled with stories about war and conquest. I mean, it's really one of the more violent books of the Bible. Okay, but it tells the history of how the Israelites regained the land that they've been promised. So Gideon was one of the judges. Now, one of the themes of the book of Judges, which maybe you remember this. I think I asked you this last year. You remember there's kind of like a pattern in all the stories in Judges? Anybody remember that? I think you did learn that in 6th grade. Not from me. You remember in the book of Judges, there's like a pattern. Like every story kind of follows a pattern. Lizzie, I think you're thinking of it.
Well, God like sends down the person.
Uh-huh.
Tells out.
Yep.
Event,
Well, the ancient Israelites. Yeah.
and then
Because they asked for help, right? They're like, we're in trouble. Send somebody, anybody, to save the day. And then what do?
I don't know the rest.
Okay, well, you're on the right track. The people are in trouble. They're being threatened by enemies or something's going on. There's famine in the land. And the people ask God for help, and he sends them a heroic figure. Sometimes men. There's even a story of one of the judges being a woman. Okay? It's Annie?
I think they like
Yeah, it's the people have turned away from God, bad things start to happen, then they turn back and say, oh, we're sorry, please, help us, send us somebody to save the day. He does, they save the day, and then as you said, they kind of throw away everything that they had gained, and then they're sad again, and they ask God for more help. So Gideon is one of those judges. Well, anyway, the reason why I'm mentioning him, you're like, Gideon, why do we need to talk about him? There's really a good story of him, like all the judges, being called by God. In other words, God said, I have something that I want you to do, Gideon. In this case, try to save, your people. Well, in the story, and there's some weird stories in Judges. Okay, they're very entertaining, but they're very unusual. In the case of Gideon, when he's called by God, he doesn't hardly believe that God is actually calling him. And he actually says, well, how do I know that you really are God and that I should get up and lead the people at the threat of losing my life? And in the story, he tells God, I'll tell you what, if you will do something for me to prove to me that you really are God, then I'll do what you're asking me to do. And there's this weird story where he takes this fleece, this garment that he had, and he lays it out on the ground. Then he tells God, he says, if you really are God, tomorrow morning when I come and find my garment on the ground, if it is wet on one side from the dew and the grass, but completely dry on the other, then I'll believe that you are God and I'll do what you asked me to do. Okay? So in the Bible, he does that, and the next morning, it does exactly what he asked it to do. It was like wet on one side, dry on the other. And Gideon's kind of like, oh, well, that's good. Can you do it one more time? Well, I want you to do the exact opposite. Okay? And God does it again, and after the second time, Gideon finally does decide to lead the Israelites. So the reason why I mention his story, because there's other people in the Bible that do the same thing. When God calls to them, they're kind of like, well, I don't know. Prove to me that I should really listen to you. Okay? But Gideon does become a hero. So on your chart here, I would say he challenged God. He questioned God when he got his call. But he did eventually listen. And he does lead the Israelites to victory over the Midianites. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you remember the Midianites, but they happened to be one of the people that the Israelites were in conflict with, and he led them into battle. Okay? There's another famous story about Gideon in terms of how he was able to win the battle that they fought. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the details there, but he basically takes a very small army, and he's able to get the enemy to flee from their camps, and they're able to defeat them that way. Okay? Gideon has kind of lived on into our modern day language. Has anyone ever heard of a Gideon Bible or heard of the Gideons? It's been a while since I've actually been in a hotel or a motel and looked inside the drawer. You ever look inside the drawer at a hotel that you're staying at? Traditionally, there would always be a couple things in the drawer. It used to be telephone books. Of course, telephone books are hardly even needed anymore because of cell phones. But there would be a telephone book, a directory, and there'd be a Bible, all right, inside of the drawer in the bedrooms in hotels. And they were called Gideon Bibles. And the Gideons were a Christian organization who kind of saw it as their job to make sure that Bibles were available to people all around the world. And sometimes they would go out on the streets and they would hand out free Bibles. They were like really little small pocket Bibles, and they would give it to people to try to spread the word. So they took their name from Gideon, who was a judge who eventually answered God's call. He didn't do it at first, but he eventually did. Okay, let's go on to the next person. Ruth. Ruth. Anyone know about Ruth? She's also from the Old Testament. In fact, there's a book named after her. It's a very short book. It's very straight and to the point, but it has a wonderful story about her. See, Addie? Ruth?
I have a question about what do we put in the Gideon for the locations?
Okay, so in the Gideon box there, his initial response was he challenged God.
Oh,
And then the thing that he did is he defeated the Midianites. He defeated their enemies. And you'll notice each of these, the call's a little bit different. In the book of Judges, it was, will you lead the people against their enemy? In some of these other books, it'll be something completely different. So the call from God comes in different forms. Anyone familiar with the book of Ruth?
I think we learned it.
Yeah, I think you didn't learn it from me, but in 6th grade you should have learned a little bit about Ruth. So, Anna, you remember anything about Ruth?
Like, I remember, wasn't she one of, was she like married to someone
Yes, she was.
that was important? I can't remember.
He was pretty important back in the day.
That's all I remember.
Okay, well, that's better than nothing. Okay, so yeah. So, and there's a lot of names in the book of Ruth, but basically, in the book of Ruth, the story starts with a man named Elimelech. And Elimelech gets married. He's from Bethlehem in Judah, and there's a famine, like there often is in the Bible, and they go to the land of Moab, which is a neighboring territory, but it's pagan, okay? Hardly any Jewish people would live there. And they go and live there, and in the story, Elimelech dies, and his wife becomes a widow. And they had 2 sons who had gotten married, and then they died. So the father died, and the 2 sons died, and so you had these women who were all now widowed. And Ruth was one of the widows, okay? Well, in the story, Naomi, who was the wife of Elimelech, tells her daughter-in-laws, you know, now that your husbands have died, you know, my sons have died, I'm going back to the land of Bethlehem, you know, where my family was from. You ought to stay here and find good young men to marry, you know, because you still have your whole life ahead of you, okay? Go out and find new husbands and have families, etc. Well, one of the daughter-in-laws decides to take her up on it and say, you know what, yeah, I'm going to stay here. Nice knowing you, good luck, but that's it. Well, Ruth tells her mother-in-law, I'm going with you. If you're going back to Bethlehem, I'm going to go with you. Even though I'm not from that place, wherever you go, I'm going to go with you. And you know, your God is going to be my God. So even though Ruth could have stayed in her homeland and tried to find a good husband, she decided that she was going to stay loyal to her mother-in-law. You can see the picture there. And they both go to Bethlehem, hoping that something good will happen. All right. Now, these women didn't really have any skills. They owned no land. All right. So what are the prospects for 2 women back in those days? Neither one of them have husbands, and they're going back to a land. How are they going to get fed? How are they going to survive? Well, the Bible says that what they ended up doing is they went out into the fields when they got back to Bethlehem, and they basically, scavenge is kind of a rough word to use, but they just hoped that farmers would leave some of their excess grain lying around, that they could gather it up and make bread to be able to survive. So, you know, that's not really a very glamorous way to live. But Ruth and Naomi were so loyal to each other, and they felt that, you know, that was God's call to them, that they decided to stay together. Now, let's go to what Anna said. Their luck is going to change, because one day when Ruth is out gathering grain off the ground, the landowner, the man who owned the land, named Boaz, came by and saw her. And they had an exchange. Ruth told him exactly why they were there, and Boaz was very impressed by her. Well, long story short, Boaz, who was not married, was so impressed by Ruth. In fact, the Bible implies that he really was very attracted to her because she was a very lovely person, that he decided to marry her. Okay? So Ruth ends up getting married to Boaz, who's very wealthy, and of course, that makes Ruth's life a lot better. And then, of course, Naomi, her mother-in-law, who's an old widower, she was helped out as well. Okay, so things work out very well. Now, Boaz and Ruth have a son named Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse. And Jesse had a son named Jesse. Remember who Jesse was the father of in the Bible? Somebody said it. David. King, as in King David. So Ruth ended up becoming the great-grandmother of King David. So you talk about having your fortunes turn around. You go from being a young widower who's out picking grain off the ground, okay, and then suddenly you're married to a very wealthy man, and you end up having a family, and you end up becoming the relative of David. And of course in the Bible, if you're related to David, who also are you related to?
Jesus.
You're related to Jesus. So you talk about things turning around. It did. Why did it turn around? Because Ruth followed her heart and what God was telling her to do. She could have just stayed in Moab, and it would have been very different. But she followed God, and it worked out. Okay? So she obeyed. Her response, okay, her initial response is she never lost faith. She obeyed, and she ended up becoming the great-grandmother of King David. So that's what she ended up doing. And if you remember in the genealogy in the New Testament, she's mentioned in the family tree of Jesus. Okay? So there's an example where you keep your faith and you listen to God's call and things work out. Okay, number 3. We're still in the Old Testament here. How about the prophet Elisha? The prophet Elisha. Does anyone know anything about Elisha? Elisha is sometimes called the successor prophet. Anyone know who he succeeded as the prophet of Israel? Elisha. I'll give you a hint. He succeeded who is believed to have been the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. Well, Isaiah was pretty great, but this guy was considered even greater. Even though he doesn't have his own book. You know, Isaiah has his own book, but this guy does not. Well, I'll give you a hint. His name's very similar to Elisha. It's Elijah, that's right. All right, so Elijah was the great prophet. At the end of Elijah's life, Elisha becomes the next prophet. Now, there's a story about, and I'm trying to draw stories out of you. There's a story about how Elisha decided to become his successor. Does anyone know that story? A couple weeks ago, the reading at Mass on Sunday had to do with Elijah. He went out in the desert and he was hiding because he was wanted. And he really didn't want to be a prophet anymore. Like his vocational call is like, okay, I really don't want to do this anymore. He had to find his courage, which he did. But at one point, God said, you know what? Your time as a prophet is done. You've answered the call. You've done what I wanted you to do. So now I have a new person who's going to take over for you. Okay? And there's a little story about Elisha. Well, if you don't remember, you've probably heard this story before. Elijah went out to Elisha, who was out plowing a field, because he was a farmer, like a lot of people were. And Elijah basically said, hey, guess what? It's your lucky day. God has picked you to take over for me. All right? And he even had like a cloak. And we talked about cloaks the other day with St. Martin of Tours. He had a cloak, and he said, this is like the official prophet cloak. So here, you get it. Okay? And Elisha was like, no, you don't understand. All right? I'm not a prophet. Okay? I didn't go to prophet you to become one. I'm a farmer. I mean, look, I'm out here plowing the field. You know, I think you want somebody else. Okay? And Elijah kind of gets upset, like, well, how can you say no? I mean, this is God's calling to you. Okay? I'm telling you, you're the guy. All right? And finally, Elisha, long story short, decides to become the prophet. Well, the great thing in the story, which I love this detail, he slaughters his ox that had been pulling his plow, and he burnt the plow, and he cooked the meat of the oxen that he had so that he could feed his family. It's kind of a symbolic thing more than anything else. What do you think that meant? When Elijah said, become a prophet, he's like, no, I'm a farmer. And then finally he decides to answer the call, and he decides to go ahead and slaughter the oxen that he had, who had pulled his plow. And then he burnt the plow, and he cooked the meat so that his family could have a meal. There's something to that. Dan? I'm sorry? Yeah, it's like, okay, that part of my life is done. Okay? Like, I couldn't become a farmer again if I wanted to. I just burnt my plow, and I slaughtered my oxen. So, you know, those are very expensive pieces of equipment to have. So it's like, I'm done with that. Here's my new life. And then Elisha went off and became a great prophet and even works miracles. And you know, in the Old Testament, you don't read as many stories about miracles, but he did. Okay? So I would put the word reluctant. His initial response was he was very reluctant. He told Elijah, no, I'm not your guy. But then he did, and he became a great prophet. And the lesson of Elisha is that a lot of times people don't always answer their call right away. Sometimes they are reluctant. Sometimes we are reluctant as we try to figure out what it is that God wants us to do. That's one of the themes, is that Very rarely do people just suddenly, when they're 10 years old, go, oh yeah, I know exactly what I'm going to do. God wants me to do this and be this. It doesn't work out that way. But it can work out if we keep our minds open to God. Okay, let's go to the New Testament. Next guy on the list is called the rich young man. You know why he's called the rich young man? Because he was rich and he was young. And he's a guy. Okay? Don't even know his name. Now, this is a very short story. Anyone know the story about the rich young man? It's in Matthew's Gospel. Addie?
This might be a different thing, but wasn't that one time where like the dad was actually not that's
Okay, you're thinking of the prodigal son, I bet. Probably. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. This story is so straight to the point. I'll go ahead and tell you. Jesus one day was approached by a rich young man, and the rich young man said, "Rabbi, teacher, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Well, follow the commandments." And the guy was like, "Oh, well, I do that. Check. Anything else I need to do?" And Jesus said, "Well, you should give all your possessions and your money to the poor and follow me." And when the guy heard that, he was like, "Oh, I can't do that because I have a lot of possessions. I have a lot of money and a lot of wealth. I can't give it up." And he leaves, and he goes away sad. That's what the Bible said. He went away sad. Okay? So he received a call from Jesus. I mean, in the flesh. And he was like, "No, I can't do that." So if you'll please put down his initial response, he rejected the call. He flat out told Jesus, "That's too much. I can't do it." Now, in terms of in the second column where it says what he actually did, you can just put a bunch of question marks because we actually don't know what the rich young man did. He's not mentioned again. Okay? So, I always like to think maybe the guy thought about it for a while, and maybe later he did come around and say, "Hey, I really should do what he told me to do." But maybe he didn't. Okay? Maybe he didn't at all. So, we'll never know. We'll never know. But this is a man who literally was talking to God in the face and was told exactly what he should do, and he was like, "I can't do that." Some people, when they receive their vocational call, can't do that. Again, go back to Matthew, that passage. Many are called, but few are chosen. This guy was not, I guess, chosen, meaning he didn't have it in his heart to be able to follow. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's talk about Levi. Levi, founder of a great brand of blue jeans. Not quite. Matthew. All right. Anyone know anything about Matthew, as in the apostle Matthew? Anyone remember what we studied this last year when we did our apostle unit? You remember what we know about Matthew? We know it because in his gospel he actually talks about himself a little bit. Is it Gabriel?
I heard the gospel and what was the person that they said that the person was there Jesus kind of out that he said someone ran.
Okay, well, you're right. Matthew did write a gospel, and there were a couple moments in which Matthew was present. Okay, he was a pretty important. He wasn't part of the inner circle, but he was pretty important. The one thing that we did know about him, if you don't remember, is that before he became an apostle, he was a tax collector. See, Jackie said that?
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. He was a tax collector. And Jesus basically came to him one day where he was probably, counting his money that he had just collected. And he's like, "I want you to follow me. Okay? Give up this life of being a tax collector, a publican." And Matthew's like, "Okay. All right." And probably a very lucrative job. You remember tax collectors in biblical times, they usually were able to make a pretty good living. Not always an honest living. All right, which kind of makes it more ironic that Jesus probably told him, "Hey, give up that life and follow me." And Matthew did. Okay? So he followed. He followed. And of course he became an apostle. And then he became an evangelist, like Gabriel just said. Okay? So you can see it's getting a little bit better. We got people rejecting. Some don't want to. As far as we know, Matthew was like, "Hey, I'm in. Okay? I will follow." All right, and then number 6, Mary. Mary was called by God. Maybe it might have been the most important call of all time. What was the most important call of all time, as far as we're concerned? See, John?
To have Mary give birth to Jesus.
Yeah, to become the mother of God. And of course, we know, what was her response?
Yes.
It was yes. Let it be done unto me, right? Like the Angelus. Okay? She definitely obeyed. And she became the mother of God. The great yes. We refer to Mary as the first true disciple when she agreed to accept her call by God to become the mother of Jesus. Okay? Now, you could do a chart with 500 more people from the Bible that were called by God and responded differently. But I wanted to kind of give you just a little bit of a list there from both Old and New and see just the variety of responses. Okay? Some of these people, things worked out exactly like they needed to. Some had to kind of work at it to be able to do that. Okay? But all of us have that call as well. And we struggle. But if we stay focused and we try to follow God, we'll be able to make the right call. Okay. All right. So if you look at the bottom of your paper, there is an article that we're going to be looking at related to vocations. All right. So, and you're going to need your laptops for this. So if you'll go ahead and take your laptops out, and there's a website that we're going to go to. And I've got the website address, but a lot of times if you do a word search, if you put the exact word search in, you should be able to find this article. This is what your assignment's going to be related to. Okay? So make sure you have your laptop. The name of the article is 10 Things to Know About Discerning a Vocation. So if you do a Google search or Chrome search, 10 things to know about discerning a vocation, you should see, probably the first thing that's going to pop up is an article from a website called vocationnetwork.org. And the article is written by a priest named Father Christian Robb. Father Christian Robb. So if you could please go to that article, we're going to read the article and we're going to talk about it. So please put in 10 things to know about discerning a vocation, and you should find the article. Type in 10 things to know about discerning a vocation. Just do the word search and you should find the article. And there's a picture. It's the exact same one up there. It shows two men sitting on a bench in front of a monastic church.
Got it.
Okay? When you see that, you'll know you have it. It is? Was it not charging? Okay, all right. You might want to let it charge. Okay? And you just have to follow along. All right. Anyone else have any problems here? Okay, so we're going to take a look at this article and we're going to discuss it together. Now, let me kind of give you a little bit of advice. Since this article is going to be basically related to the assignment you're going to complete. I would recommend, if you have a piece of paper or a notebook or something, we're going to talk through this article, and I'm going to recommend that you jot down a couple things because you're going to be using this article to complete the assignment. Okay? Now, this article, as I said, is authored by a priest who just happens to be a priest at St. Meinrad Seminary. Okay? So here is a World Wide Web article from someone who actually lives fairly close to us. Everyone know where St. Meinrad's located? Okay, it's down in southern Indiana, and it is it's the seminary where almost all of our priests in our diocese are trained. Okay, so this kind of has some local color to it. All right, so we're going to take a look at the article. Now, the nice thing about this article is, as it says, he breaks it into 10 pieces of advice about how to discern a vocation. Now, when you're discerning a vocation, you're trying to figure out what God's call is to you. And Father Christian Robb has some advice about how to successfully do that. So we're going to read through all 10 of them, and we'll talk about like what the key point is to each of the 10. So if you can jot down number 1 to 10, and then you're not going to write down everything. Okay, we're going to target what the key idea is for each of these. But I would recommend that you make a little note on this because it'll make your life easier for your assignment. Okay? All right, so he starts off by saying, if you'll scroll down a little bit, he says, joyfully and gratefully I reflect upon the fact that many hard years of going back and forth over whether I should give priesthood and religious life a try or make a commitment to them are over. So he obviously now is a priest. His call was to become a priest. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at the first one, which is called God Calls. Okay? God Calls. Could someone go ahead and read that next paragraph there? And if you could follow, I know it's not easy to hear everybody necessarily, but if you could read where he says, at the heart of the... Okay, Cameron, start us off there.
At the heart of the American dream is the idea that one can be anything one wants to be. The glory of living in free nation is that we have the opportunity to make ourselves what we are. Alas, we are taught from a young age that it is important to be true to our dreams and accordingly plot a course for our lives. All of that isn't unimportant. The problem though for a personal faith is that it can potentially leave God out of the decision-making process.
All right, thank you. So, people talk about the American dream. It's like if you live in our country, you can pretty much become and do whatever you set your mind to. Okay, that's kind of part of what we think of when we think of our country. And indeed, we have a lot of freedom in our lives to be able to make choices. Now we have to work, and there's things we have to do to be able to meet those goals. But it's like whatever you feel like you want to be, you can become if you work at it. Now, the key point that he makes there is that for a person of faith, whatever it is that you decide that you want to do with your life, you need to make sure that you include someone in the process of your discernment. Who needs to be part of that? This is what he's getting to. Who needs to be part of the decision-making process there? God does. So whatever it is, okay, make sure that God's part of that process. He goes on to say, vocation comes from a word that means to call. We already covered that. From God. The call comes from God. We need to make sure that we include God in that process. He says through prayer and to listen to God's will. So key point number 1, your call comes from God, and you need to include him in that. Whatever you think your call is. Okay? Again, it could be single life, married life, religious life, priesthood, whatever it might be. Make sure God's part of the process, because if you leave him out, then you're really not following a vocation. Okay? All right, number 2, vocation is a two-way gift. I'll read this one. God really does want us to be happy. When it comes to a vocation, we sometimes struggle to believe that. Perhaps we fear that God will ask us to do something we will hate. Maybe we think God's will, in a sentence, to a dreadful life. On the contrary, in John's Gospel, Christ says, I came that we may have life and have it abundantly. Okay? So in other words, God wants us to be happy. We need to trust in him. And whatever that calling is that he gives us, we need to know that he is wanting to lead us in the right way. Okay? Now, I shared with you some stories where people were like, no, I don't like that vocation. The rich man, I don't want to give up the things I have. Okay? Alicia, no, I'm a farmer. I don't want to become a prophet. Okay? He had to think about it for a little bit. So, point number 2 is that God's call to us, or his vocation, is a gift. It's a gift for us. It's not meant to make our lives miserable. It's actually there to help us find happiness. And he's guiding us there. Okay? But we have to be willing to follow. Okay? So it's a gift. It's not a burden. It's not a curse. Okay? The vocational call to us is a gift. And if we're open to it, we'll be happier. Okay? All right, number 3. Would someone read, because vocation is something we give to God? This is point number 3. Let's see. Who have we not heard from?
Front office, this is Mrs. I'm preschooler that I tried practicing for the fire drill.
Let's see, Seth, you have it pulled up there?
Yes.
Okay, can you go ahead and read, because vocation is something we give to God.
Because vocation is something we give to God, it is important that we have the freedom to make this offering. God gives us free choices. You have the freedom to marry or into a religious life or remain single. You have the freedom to pursue this or that line of work. If we are not in a place in life where we are vocation, perhaps due to an immune field or an addiction, that we must increase in our freedom before we can make a vocational choice. God, rest assured, helps us in this process.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So at the very beginning, here's the key phrase. When we are making our vocational choice, we all have freedom. Okay? We have freedom in our making of choices. God doesn't make us do anything. And of course, this is true in every aspect of our life. Okay? Free will. We have personal, what we call agency. You can decide how and what you're going to do in your life. Okay? If God is calling you and you're like, I don't want to do that, I mean, you can reject it. All right? God is not going to send down a thunderbolt and make you do something. All right? So having freedom is very important. All right? Of course, it makes life a little challenging because it allows us to maybe make a bad choice, all right, versus the good choice. But we have freedom. God preserves our freedom when it comes to vocations. He doesn't make us do anything. Again, the rich young man, Jesus didn't make him obey, okay? He gave him the opportunity to. All right, number 4, this is called Know Thyself. It says a key insight shared by many saints is that spiritual growth begins in self-knowledge. Have you ever heard that phrase? Know thyself? Well, it's kind of an old wisdom saying, okay? You got to know yourself before you make a choice. You got to know who you are. Self-awareness is what that is talking about there, okay? So let me make sure, so that's number 4. Okay, let's go ahead and go, so everyone get that? You got to know yourself. Self-awareness will help you be able to make a better choice about your vocation. You know, for example, if someone was considering, you know, the religious life or to become a priest, you know, if they kind of know themselves and they're like, you know what, I don't think I could handle taking those vows, then, you know, maybe that, or maybe you don't have a skill that would facilitate living that life and serving God that way. You might say, you know, that's not for me. Maybe there's something else that I could do that would be better. Okay, number 5. It says an authentic Christian vocation is always rooted first of all in being a disciple of Jesus Christ. To better know God's will for our lives and to follow it, it is imperative that we first come to know Jesus Christ and begin to model our lives after His. By encountering the Word of God in Scripture, we receive the light that enlightens everyone. His life inspires, motives, and directs ours. Okay, now here's the key phrase. Look at the next paragraph. He says, before we can be an apostle, which is someone who's sent out, we must first be a disciple. So think about that for a moment. We know that the apostles were those who were sent out. But before you can become an apostle and be sent out, you have to learn to follow. And that's what a disciple is. Okay? So, you know, you got to learn to walk before you run. You got to become a disciple before you become an apostle. You've got to be able to listen to God before you can go out and lead. Okay? Mother Teresa, again, I'll use her as an example. She felt a vocational call, but she had to follow first before she could be the leader of the Sisters of Charity. Okay? So become a disciple first, then you can become an apostle. All right, number 6 says, find your place in the symphony. Okay? Would someone read, the church is like a, Lizzie?
The church is like a symphony. It is one group playing one score, but also full of uniqueness. There are lots of different instruments. Personally, I think of that score as love.
Okay, so the metaphor here is that the church is like a symphony. Now, can someone explain that? How is being a member of the church like a symphony? Who in here has been in band or played in symphonic band? Okay, a lot of you. So you would probably understand this very well. How is the church like a symphony? See, Annie? Uh-huh. Yeah, the music that's created by a symphonic band or an orchestra, the harmony of that music comes forth from the fact that everybody plays a different instrument, okay? Some play the woodwinds, some play the percussion, some play the strings, okay? Imagine if everybody was like, well, I want to be percussion. I want to bang the drum. I don't want to play the oboe. Okay, well, what if we need the oboe, okay? So, everyone's got to fulfill their part in the symphony, and when that happens, the music that is made is harmonious. So, in the church, not everybody will be a priest. Not everyone's going to become a nun or a monk. Not everyone is necessarily going to be married and have a family, okay? Some people might become doctors. Some might become lawyers. Some might open a business. Some might be in sales because, your career is part of your vocation. It's not all of it, but it's a piece of it. Not everyone's going to do the same thing, okay? So that's an important thing to understand. Think of being a Christian like being a member of the symphony, okay? Or you could use a sports team, okay? Not everybody can be the quarterback. You got to have people to block, okay? Every role, every position is important. So think of that as, well, my vocation is not as great as his vocation or her vocation. Well, their vocation is not yours, all right? You seek your own and just do what God is calling you to do. Okay, let's go on to number 7. It says, ask for help. No one can discern a vocation alone. Friends, ministers, family members, and fellow parishioners can be helpful sources of support and insight. These folks can often see things that we don't readily perceive. As one progresses a little bit along the path of discernment, a spiritual director is often necessary, especially if one is discerning priesthood or the religious life. So number 7 basically says, who can help you in making your vocational choice? Friends, family members, members in your community, could be a teacher, could be a priest, could be a coach, could be a neighbor. In other words, everybody can help you in discerning your vocation, okay? Everybody can do that, but you got to be attentive and try to take advice that you get from all of those different people. Okay, number 8, let's go. We got 3 left here. Expect some blindness, okay? I have yet to meet anyone, he says, whom God has struck with a lightning bolt, I mentioned that earlier, and told exactly what to do with his or her life. Nor can I say that it ever happened to me. But I have learned to appreciate the blindness that must, in some sense, be there. This is true because our vocation must be made a gift in faith. If we knew exactly what God wanted or what would make us most happy, there would be no risk, no cost, and in effect, no love. So when it comes to discerning your vocation, expect some blindness. What does he mean by that? Expect some blindness. See, Harrison?
Expect like a surprise.
Maybe. In other words, what you might think you have it all figured out now, and then if you go ahead a few years, you might be in a very different situation, and it might surprise you. Maybe. Okay? All right, so that's good. Anyone else? Expect some blindness. See, Annie? Okay. Well, when you're blind, figuratively speaking, you can't see. And it's like you're in the dark. The lights are all turned out and you can't find anything. And you're like, gosh, I don't know what to do. I don't know where it is. Where do I go? Okay? Well, life, there's times when you're not always going to know what's going to is going to happen. You don't always know what you're going to do. When you guys get into high school here pretty soon, people are going to be saying, well, what are you going to do? What classes are you going to take? What's your major going to be? Are you going to go to a college? Are you going to go to a tech school? Are you going to get into the workforce? What are you going to do? All right? And you'll feel a lot of stress, and you'll be like, God, I want to know. I feel like I'm just floating around. Well, there's times in life where you're going to float around a little bit. You won't always know exactly what you're going to do. Okay? You need to understand that people from the beginning of time have had those feelings. Okay? So if you're one of those people that always like to be on top of everything and know exactly what's going on and know exactly what you're going to do, that's not the way life always is. Okay? All right, number 9, God writes straight with crooked lines. Have you ever heard that phrase before? God writes straight with crooked lines. And that sounds like an oxymoronic statement. How can you do that? But he does. John, before we even take a look at what the article says there, what do you think that means? God writes straight with crooked lines.
Even when we're like going away from him, helps
Uh-huh.
make sure our life is going good and just repent.
Yeah, and there's a lot of us that are crooked lines. Our lives are not perfect. We all are imperfect in some way, but God will take our imperfections and use them for the good. Okay? Just to kind of save you a little bit of work here in that section, he gives some examples of people who in a way were kind of like crooked lines. Peter, Paul, Mary Magdalene, he gives those as examples of crooked lines. Okay? We know Peter a lot of times was really clueless about what was going on, but yet Jesus used him to become the rock of the church. Paul, you know about St. Paul. What's his story? Talk about a crooked line. What about Paul? We talked about him a lot last year, even though it was partially remotely. What's Paul's infamous claim to fame, or infamy? Remember before he was known as Paul, he was known as... Remember what his original name before he became Paul? It began with an S. His name was Saul. And he was a not-so-nice guy, if you remember. All right? He literally oversaw the killing of early Christians. So that's a pretty crooked line there. But eventually he flipped, he converted, and of course he became one of the most important people in preaching Christianity. So that's a crooked line there. Mary Magdalene, according to the Bible, she was a notorious sinner at one point, but she repented and of course became one of the most important disciples of Jesus. Remember, she was one of the people that saw Jesus, the risen Christ, after his crucifixion. Okay, so the idea is you might say, well, I can't be that kind of person. All right, well, you can. You don't have to worry about being perfect. You don't have to be a saint. Everybody has a vocational call. Okay? All right, let's get to finally number 10. And again, Father Rob, he is a spiritual director. And part of his job, and I believe he's still at St. Meinrad, is to give advice to young men about whether they want to become a priest or not. So he understands the fact that people don't always have it figured out. So he says, discernment is not your vocation. Okay? He says, perhaps the most, can someone read that for me? Perhaps the most helpful bit of wisdom I received in discernment was the nudging of my spiritual director when he said, discernment is not your vocation. There comes a time in the process of exploring who we are and what we want to do with our lives that we must take a risk and try something. God rewards our efforts, and God can do much more with a mistake than with inertia. In other words, you can't just spend your whole life thinking, well, what am I going to do with my life? What's my vocation? I don't know. Okay? At some point in time, you just have to commit and say, you know what, I'm kind of feeling that way. I might still have a doubt here or there, but just go ahead and take that step off of the ledge, okay, and take a risk. Sometimes life involves taking a risk, all right? You probably know there's people, in college, they talk about them being, 5 and 6 year college students. If you're a 5 or 6 or 7 year college student, and you're like, well, I don't know what my major is, so I'm just going to keep taking classes, okay, and you're 24, 25 years old, you probably need to go ahead and go out there and do something. You can't be a student your whole life, okay, or whatever it might be. Sometimes you just got to say, you know what, I'm just going to go in this direction and just know that God's going to get me through it, all right? I might stumble, I might fall, things might not work out, I might have to try to, redesign and reorder my life, but hey, that's the way it goes. So he's saying, don't spend your whole life discerning your vocation. At some point, you just got to make a choice and take action. Okay? All right, so that article, I know it sounds like he's talking about just people seeking the priesthood, but discerning a vocation is something that everybody needs to do. Okay? All right, so I'm going to stop our video for a moment.